And the glory of the celestial is one, even as the glory of the sun is one. And the glory of the terrestrial is one, even as the glory of the moon is one. The glory of the telestial is one, even as the glory of the stars is one. For as one star differs from another star in glory, even so differs one from another in glory in the telestial world. For these are they who are of Paul.
Today we will be talking in the first part of our discussion of Doctrine and Covenants, section 76. Brethren, we say the first part simply because I don't know how in the world we can cover this in 10 parts, let alone 2. This is a wonderful and a very meaningful revelation that was given, referred to by the saints of the time as the vision. Of course, most of us look at it, or students of the Scriptures look at it as the degrees of glory, but there's so many things here that we could spend a long time discussing just portions of this. So we'll try to take it in at least 2 parts and see the best way that we can handle the material here. You know, I think it might be well worth saying that not everything regarding the degrees of glory or heavens and the great plan is covered here in section 76. As a matter of fact, the prophet Joseph said that he could explain 100-fold more than what he received in this section alone. And I think it would be well, though, if perhaps we frame some of the background of this section, since it has such power, to see how the section came about, some of the interesting circumstances dealing with the time, and also some of the, perhaps maybe the impact that this section had, that maybe some people wouldn't get just by jumping straight in and reading the heading or the verses. Richard, perhaps you could start us off in framing this section with some of the things that were taking place, circumstances, the background, what was happening with Joseph and Sidney, etc.
Well, Joseph was translating the Scriptures, which doesn't mean that he was going to Latin or Greek or some ancient language, but going through the Bible and with the power of inspiration, restoring or clarifying or even correcting on occasion passages. And one of the prevailing ideas of the time was that there was one heaven and one hell. And as Joseph was pondering John chapter 5, verse 29, he wondered about this. In that verse, we read that some will be saved unto the resurrection of life, while others will go unto the resurrection of damnation. And that seems to suggest the 2 destinations. But as he pondered this and prayed about it, we read in Doctrine and Covenants, section 76, verse 17, what the Lord had to say we should understand this to mean, that some will come forth in the resurrection of the just, and others in the resurrection of the unjust. In other words, there will be 2 major divisions in the resurrection, but nothing is said about how many destinations there will be. And that's what the message of the rest of the section is.
You know, I thought it was interesting you mentioned about John chapter 5 is I always thought that maybe this was coming from reading In My Father's House There Are Many Mansions, but this frames it in a different way of the notion of being accountable and having something that's coming according to that which, and therefore it designates it in many varying, perhaps, degrees, which we will find in this wonderful vision. Lawrence, tell us a little bit about some other elements of this, perhaps some of, not necessarily the mechanics, but the situation that's taking place. We know this was given in the section heading in Hiram, Ohio. I think the setting in and of itself is an interesting setting, and maybe some of the accounts of how this was given and some of that.
Well, as we're aware, the prophet Joseph Smith, and I guess Sidney Rigdon as well, were living with the Johnson family at this time. And of course, it's a great family, and wonderful things happened there. 2 of their sons became apostles, in fact. And Father Johnson was a generous man and took Joseph and his family in, designated one of the rooms in the house as a translating room for Joseph. And so he had access to that, and the house, as you know, is still standing. But he and Sidney were doing the work of translation which the Lord had commanded them. And interestingly enough, they apparently, at least on this occasion, they had other people who came and watched them. And that's quite interesting. Apparently there were 12 men who were in the room when this vision occurred. And one of them was a fellow named Philo Dibble. He was later a secretary to the prophet and knew the prophet very well, and he leaves an interesting account of seeing this. He said that the men in the room, could not see the vision, but they felt the glory and the power, and they knew what was going on. Joseph and Sidney apparently were staring into a blank wall as they talked back and forth and said, did you see that? And did you hear that? And talked back and forth about the vision. And of course, as we know, the Lord stopped the vision on at least 4 occasions and told them to take notes. Write what you've seen. And they did. And later that night, they composed basically section 76 from the notes they had taken. Dibble told a lot of interesting things. One amusing little part of it was he said that after the vision was completed, which was close to an hour and a half, Joseph Smith at one time said if you could gaze into heaven for 5 minutes, you would know more than has ever been written on the subject. They gazed into heaven for an hour and a half. But as the vision closed, he said Joseph was bold as a lion, strong and bold as a lion. And Sidney Rigdon was weak as water, he said. Joseph, noticing his condition, commented to the brethren in the room, Brother Sidney is not as used to this as I am. Interesting principle, and apparently a true one. But anyway, we're indebted a lot to him for the information we have about the setting.
You know, it's interesting when we look at this, then, at least the content, so we have the transmission of the information, and then we have it recorded. Tell me a little bit about how the saints receive this. I mean, this is a landmark vision. Just calling it the vision sets something special about this. But I think sometimes we take it for granted that this is the way it's always been, and, well, of course, there are the different degrees of glory. I remember even as a missionary being somewhat surprised when I would present the plan of salvation and get to the part about differing degrees of glory, that people were surprised and shocked over that, and that they had never heard of it. It was almost like, wait, surely you've heard of this before, but give some thought on this, John.
You know, the missionaries of the early days, in Joseph Smith's lifetime, of course, talked about this vision. They copied it. They took it out with them. They presented it to members and to folks that they were teaching, almost as if it were like a tract, and people would read it. And of course, we all know how impressive the section is, but they freely used it. They felt like it was a proselyting tool, and out they went. The vision.
Right.
It was really something.
And it's interesting that maybe it wasn't received as well as or as easily as we might. I remember reading even Brigham Young said, boy, this is contrary to all of my traditional learning. This is a landmark experience where it starts to weave saints with the theology of our Father in heaven in His way, and really challenges them to think outside of, perhaps we could say, outside of the box.
Could I just share this from Wilford Woodruff? Sure. He was 26 years old, and he had not seen very many Mormons, including Joseph Smith. He had just joined the church, and he got a copy of the Revelation. As John was saying, they use it as a missionary tract, but this is the effect it had on him. Before I saw Joseph, I said I did not care how old he was, how young he was. I did not care how he looked, whether his hair was long or short. The man that advanced that revelation was a prophet of God. I knew it for myself. So it had both a positive and a negative effect on some people that were not prepared for it.
Very nice. Very good. Well, an interesting part about this revelation that I think is worth mentioning as it starts to come out or unfolds as we start to look at it, it does come with an interesting comparison, and also where it contrasts items together. We see somewhat of a prologue in the beginning, and I think that we ought to at least touch upon this, because sometimes there's a tendency, let's just jump right in and get to and start with celestial kingdom and go through the kingdoms. But the way that the Lord reveals this is really a wonderful teaching tool according to perhaps His design. It gives us an opportunity to go through and compare. You'll see talking about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and then immediately following, we start to speak about Satan, Lucifer, and then we talk about sons of perdition, and then we talk immediately about the construct of the celestial glory. There's a wonderful comparing and contrasting going on, and teaching us in perhaps a wonderful way or a methodology here, so that we might truly sense the power of what's happening here.
Sense the difference between what can be earned if one lives the gospel versus what would be the ultimate opposite
Good point.
reward.
As a matter of fact, in some ways, as a teacher, sometimes I think about this, teaching us in a way not only so that we will understand, but so that we cannot misunderstand, and see that through the comparison, the contrast. John?
I really like the way in verse 12 where they say, by the power of the Spirit, our eyes were opened and our understandings were enlightened. If you come down to 19, and while we meditated upon these things, the Lord touched the eyes of our understanding. We can learn a little bit about revelation here and how it comes to prophets. And of course, sometimes they do see things. Other times it's a meditation, it's spiritual eyes that things are seen with. And clearly, because those men could not see that were in the room, we know that sometimes prophets will see things that we do not.